Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I went up there because my uncle died alone. Nobody else wanted to deal with his property, and December was the only time I could take off work without risking my job. He lived off a county service road that barely showed up on Google Maps, the kind that turns into a suggestion once snow starts falling. I remember passing the last plowed turnoff just before dusk and thinking I should have turned back then. The sky had already flattened into that dull gray that comes before a storm, and the light felt thin, like it was running out early on purpose. The road narrowed as I drove. Trees pressed in from both sides, birch trunks pale and scarred, their branches brittle with ice. My tires crunched over packed snow and frozen mud. There were no tracks ahead of me, which meant nobody had been up there in at least a day, maybe longer. The GPS stopped updating about half a mile from the house. The arrow just floated on an empty screen while the road kept going. The house sat back from the road behind a drifted yard. No fence, no mailbox. Just a single-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. A shed leaned slightly east like it had been pushed and never pushed back. The place looked smaller than I remembered from childhood visits. Or maybe I had grown and it had not. Snow had piled against the lower walls, and the windows were dark, crusted with frost on the inside. I parked where the road widened enough to fit a car and shut off the engine. The silence felt active. Wind moved through the trees in short bursts, lifting loose snow and dropping it again. The air smelled clean and sharp, cold enough to hurt when I breathed too deep. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the house, listening. Nothing moved near it, no lights, no sound from inside, just the slow settling of snow. Inside, everything smelled like kerosene and old boots. That smell hit me as soon as I opened the door, heavy and stale, like it had soaked into the walls. The house was colder than outside in a way that felt wrong. The heater sat dead in the corner, a rusted unit my uncle never trusted enough to leave on. The floors creaked under my weight. Furniture sat where it had been left years ago. A chair pulled out from the table, a coat still hanging near the door. Dust lay thick on everything except the path between the kitchen and the back room, where my uncle must have walked every day. I unpacked the basics. Food, water, extra batteries, blankets. I set up in the living room near the old stove. The windows there faced the road. I wiped frost from the glass with my sleeve and looked out. The road was barely visible, just a pale strip cutting through darker snow. Trees crowded close on both sides. Nothing moved. My uncle had always talked about something pacing the road at night. He said it like a complaint, not a story. He drank, so nobody took it seriously. We assumed it was deer or coyotes or his own footsteps echoing back to him when he checked the locks. Standing there alone, with night settling in, I tried to tell myself the same thing. I cooked a simple meal and ate it straight from the pan. The stove gave off a dry heat that did not reach far. Shadows stayed thick in the corners. The house made noises as it cooled, soft pops and ticks from wood and metal. I told myself every sound had a reason. Old houses always talk. I went to bed early because there was nothing else to do. The bedroom faced the road too. One narrow window above the dresser. I did not bother wiping it clear. I did not want to see out. I lay on top of the covers in my clothes, boots near the bed. The cold crept in from the walls. My breath fogged the air. Sometime after midnight I heard footsteps outside. They came from the road, slow, steady. Each step pressed into the snow with a dry crunch. Too measured to be an animal moving at random. They stopped. Then started again. Closer. I held still and counted the seconds between sounds. The pace did not change. No hesitation. No circling, just a straight line toward the house. The steps stopped directly in front of the door. I waited for them to move away. They did not. No shuffling, no retreat, Just the absence of sound where sound had been. That absence stretched. My ears strained for anything else. Wind. Branches. Breathing. Nothing reached me. Minutes passed. My body stayed tense, ready for noise that never came. The cold pressed harder against my skin. I did not sleep. Eventually, pale light seeped into the room, and the world returned without explanation. When I checked the door at dawn, there were no tracks. The snow lay smooth, untouched. I spent the day sorting through my uncle's things. Papers, tools, old cans of fuel. His boots by the door were worn down unevenly, soles thinned at the heel. The windows had been wiped clear from the inside so many times the glass looked polished. The path from the back room to the front door was worn into the floorboards more than anywhere else. That night, the footsteps came again. Same pace. Same direction. Same stop in front of the door. I stood this time heart-pounding, listening. I told myself it was someone lost, someone passing through. The road was used by service crews sometimes. Hunters. Snowmobilers. But nobody would walk that road at night in December without reason. The steps did not leave. They stayed there until morning. By the third night, exhaustion made everything feel sharp and unreal. I drank more coffee than I should have. My hands shook. The cold never eased. I noticed things I had ignored before. The door frame had deep scratches near the handle, old ones layered over each other. The lock had been replaced more than once. Extra bolts sat unused in a drawer. A notebook on the table held dates and times written in my uncle's shaky hand. No explanations. Just marks made at regular hours through long winters. The footsteps came earlier that night, before full dark. I was sitting by the window when I heard them. I watched the road. Snow fell lightly, just enough to catch the light from inside. I saw nothing moving. The steps reached the door anyway. They stopped. I waited until my legs cramped from standing still. When I finally moved, it was because something else changed. Not the sound. The feeling. The sense that whoever was out there was not waiting for me to open the door. They were waiting for me to acknowledge them. I turned on every light in the house. I opened the door. The cold hit hard, stealing my breath. The porch was empty. The road stretched out, smooth, except for a single set of tracks leading from the trees to my door. No return path. The prints were deep, heavy, made by boots worn down unevenly at the heel. They matched my uncle's. I followed them with my eyes back to the tree line. The tracks stopped there. No disturbance beyond that point. No place where someone could have turned around without leaving a mark. I closed the door and locked it. My hands shook so badly I had to try twice. I did not sleep. At dawn, I packed my car. Before leaving, I checked the shed. Inside, I found what I had missed before. My uncle's second pair of boots, newer, barely worn. The ones by the door were older. The ones he would have worn every night on the road. The ones he wore until he could not walk back. I realized then what had been pacing the road. Not something outside the house, but a habit worn so deep it stayed behind. My uncle had walked that stretch every night, checking, listening, convincing himself he was not alone. When he collapsed out there, nobody found him until spring. He had died on that road, pacing it the same way he always had. The footsteps never left because nobody ever left them. I drove out as the snow started to fall harder, erasing the tracks as I went. By the time I reached the plowed turnoff, the road behind me had already begun to disappear. Matt and I left Utah later than planned, because finals had dragged on longer than either of us expected. The campus emptied out fast once exams ended, and by the time we loaded the car, the parking lots were already half buried under fresh snow. We were both exhausted in a specific way that came from weeks of poor sleep and constant stress. The kind where your body feels heavy, but your thoughts keep racing. We just wanted to get back to California, back to familiar roads and air that did not burn your lungs when you breathed it in. The weather report had looked manageable when we checked it that afternoon. Cold, snow possible, nothing extreme, Utah weather never stays predictable for long. Once we got on the highway heading west, the sky flattened into a dull gray sheet, and the mountains ahead disappeared behind it. Snow started light, then heavier, then thick enough that the headlights reflected back at us like a wall. The wind picked up fast. Snow came in sideways, slamming against the windshield hard enough to sound like grit. We slowed down with everyone else. Traffic tightened, brake lights glowing red through the white. Plows passed us going the opposite direction, throwing curtains of snow that erased the road for seconds at a time. Matt drove with both hands tight on the wheel. I watched the road markers flick by and felt the tension settle into my chest. We were already far from any town. Nothing around us but open land and dark hills. The announcement signs lit up overhead, flashing warnings about chain requirements and reduced visibility. Then another sign appeared, brighter and more final, stating that the pass ahead was closed. Highway patrol vehicles blocked the road farther up, their lights washing the snow in red and blue. Cars pulled off where they could. Some turned around. Others followed the patrol directions toward a rest area just off the highway. The rest area sat a short distance down a side road that looked barely maintained. Snow drifted across it in uneven ridges. The lot itself was mostly cleared, but new snow was already filling it in. There were no cars parked there when we pulled in. That stood out right away. A closed pass usually meant a crowd of stranded drivers. Instead, the place looked abandoned. The building was a low concrete structure with bathrooms on either side and a covered picnic area in the middle. Sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow that did not reach far beyond the immediate circle beneath them. Snow blew through the light and vanished into darkness. We sat in the car with the engine running, listening to the wind shove against the doors. Matt checked his phone again. No signal. Mine showed the same. The pass was closed until morning according to the last update, but the time estimate was gone. We were not going anywhere soon. Driving back the way we came felt risky. The road behind us had already started icing over, and visibility was worse now than before. We decided to stay put and wait it out. Sleeping in shifts seemed like the safest option. The car had a full tank. We had blankets and coats in the back. It was not comfortable, but it was manageable. We did not go inside the building. Something about it felt off before we even got close. The bathroom lights flickered on and off in an uneven rhythm. Not the quick flicker of a failing bulb, but a slow, irregular pulse. On, dim, bright off, then back again. Each cycle took several seconds. The wind pushed snow through the open sides of the picnic area, piling it against the concrete walls. We stayed in the car, seats reclined slightly, coats still on. I took the first sleep shift. Matt stayed awake, engine idling low, heater running just enough to keep the windows clear. The wind never stopped. It scraped snow along the sides of the car and rattled something loose on the building nearby. The sound came and went without pattern. I slept in short stretches, the kind where you drift off and surface again without knowing how long it has been. At some point, the heater cycled off, and the cold crept in around my feet. I pulled the blanket higher and turned my face toward the seat. The next thing I remember clearly is Matt shaking my shoulder. Not hard, but urgent. His face was pale, eyes wide, fixed on something behind me. He leaned close and whispered that someone was standing behind my seat. The words hit before my body caught up. My heart jumped, and heat rushed through my chest. I twisted in my seat fast, expecting to see his reflection laughing or some stranger pressed against the glass. There was no one there. The back seat was empty. The rear windows were dark, snow caked thick along the edges. Nothing moved outside. The rest area looked the same as before, empty lot, flickering lights, blowing snow. I turned back toward the window beside me, and that was when I saw it. The glass was fogged, not from the inside. The condensation bloomed outward from a small area at eye level, spreading in a thin oval shape. The rest of the window stayed clear, frost forming only at the edges. This fog was fresh, wet, and warm. It looked exactly like breath. Cold rushed into my stomach. The air inside the car was dry and warm. We had been running the heater. If I had breathed against the glass, it would have been from the inside. This was on the outside. The shape pressed close, too close to be accidental. I wiped the inside of the window with my sleeve. The fog stayed. My skin prickled along my arms. I leaned closer and saw faint streaks trailing downward where moisture had started to freeze and slide. Matt did not move. He stared straight ahead, hands locked on the wheel. The engine hummed low. The wind continued to howl, but it sounded distant, like it had dropped away from the immediate space around us. We did not get out. We did not open the doors. We sat there, breathing shallow, watching the fog slowly fade as the cold reclaimed the glass. It took longer than it should have. After several minutes, nothing else happened. No footsteps. No shapes moving through the snow. The rest area stayed empty. The lights flickered on and off without change. We stayed awake together after that. Neither of us could sleep. The cold pressed in harder, and we turned the heater up slightly, watching the exhaust plume drift back and vanish into the dark. Hours passed slow and heavy. Time felt thick, stretched. My eyes burned from staying open. Every sound outside the car felt sharper. Snow sliding off the roof of the building made my heart jump. The wind shifted direction and howled through the picnic area supports, making a hollow moan. Just before dawn, the wind eased. The snow fell straighter, softer. The sky lightened enough to reveal shapes again. Gray replaced black. The rest area came into focus, and with it, the ground around the car. That was when we saw the footprints. They circled the car in a loose ring. Not close enough to touch, but near enough that whoever made them could have reached out. The prints were clear, pressed deep into the snow. Each step was visible, heel to toe. No shoes, no boots. Toes splayed slightly, skin texture faintly visible where the snow had compacted and begun to glaze. Bare feet. They went all the way around the car, crossing behind it, looping past my window, then back around to the front. The pattern was slow and deliberate. No running. No stumbling. Each step placed carefully. There were no prints leading toward the car from any direction. None leading away. Just the circle. The rest of the lot was untouched. Smooth snow broken only by tire tracks from when we pulled in and a few drifts piled against the building. No other human marks. We stayed inside the car and took photos through the glass. My hands shook enough that I had to brace the phone against the steering wheel. The cold made my fingers stiff, but it was not just the temperature. My chest felt tight, like I had been holding my breath for hours. As daylight strengthened, the footprints began to soften. The edges blurred as the sun pushed weak warmth across the surface. We watched them fade, watched the evidence of the night disappear inch by inch. By mid-morning, a highway patrol truck pulled into the lot. The officer stepped out, boots crunching fresh snow, breath puffing white. We stayed in the car until he waved us over. We showed him the photos. He studied them without comment, jaw tight. Then he walked the perimeter where the prints had been. Only shallow impressions remained, barely visible. He told us that the pass would reopen later that afternoon. He asked if we had seen anyone else overnight. We shook our heads. He did not say much else. He mentioned that sometimes people got stranded out there without proper gear. Hypothermia did strange things to judgment. People wandered. They took off clothes. They moved without direction. He did not explain the lack of approach tracks. He did not explain the fogged window. After he left, we sat in silence until the road reopened. When we finally drove away, I looked back once at the rest area shrinking behind us. The lights were steady now. The building looked ordinary, harmless. We made it back to California without further trouble. Classes resumed the next semester. Life moved forward the way it always does. I still think about that night every winter, about the careful circle in the snow, about warm breath against frozen glass, about someone close enough to see me sleeping, standing barefoot in a storm, leaving no path behind them. I never found an explanation that fit every detail. What I do know is that nothing supernatural happened. Someone was there. A real person. Cold, desperate, and close enough to touch the car. That knowledge unsettles me more than any ghost ever could. I went back because I needed to prove something to myself. That was the honest reason, even if it sounded thin when I thought about it too hard. I had avoided that trail for years without admitting it. I told myself I had outgrown it, that there were better hikes closer to town, safer ones, trails that stayed open year-round. None of that was true. I stayed away because the last time I had been there, something had shaken my sense of control, and I had never gone back to test whether it was real or just fear stretched by memory. December gave me the excuse. The semester was over, work was slow, and the first snowfall had been light. The mountains looked clean instead of buried. I drove up early, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The road was plowed only halfway, the rest packed down by a few passing trucks. The trailhead lot was empty. No tire marks from that morning. No fresh footprints. The gate across the access road was open, its chain hanging loose and frozen stiff. The sign that said Wantar Silos Ui was half buried, the letters dulled by years of weather. I parked anyway. I told myself I would walk a mile at most, just enough to stand in the trees again and remind myself that nothing owned that place. The air smelled like cold dirt and pine sap. Snow covered the ground in thin patches, not enough to hide the earth underneath. My boots left clear prints, clean ovals with sharp edges. I noticed that right away, because it meant I would see anything else just as clearly. The trail climbed steadily, winding through lodgepole pine and scrub oak. The branches were bare and stiff. No wind moved them. No birds cut through the quiet. Even my breathing felt loud. Each step made a dry crunch, not the soft sound of deep snow, but the brittle break of frost. I remembered that sound from childhood hikes with my father, when winter felt like a challenge instead of a warning. About 15 minutes in, I stopped to adjust my gloves. That was when I turned and saw the second set of tracks. They followed mine closely, offset by just enough to show intent. The stride was longer than mine, the heel deeper. The toe dragged slightly forward, as if the person had more weight or longer legs. I stared at them longer than I meant to. I told myself it had to be an earlier hiker, someone who had come through before the cold hardened the ground. That explanation worked for a moment, until I traced the line back with my eyes and saw where the trail entrance had been untouched when I arrived. I looked farther back, all the way to the bend where the trees thickened. My prints began there, so did the others. I stood still for a full minute listening. The forest stayed empty, no snapping branches, no shifting snow, nothing that suggested a presence close enough to matter. I felt stupid for letting it get to me. The human mind looks for patterns even when none exist. I knew that. I stepped forward again. As I climbed, the second set of tracks changed. Sometimes they matched my pace exactly. Sometimes they lagged behind, then caught up in long, easy strides. In a few places, they vanished completely where the ground was too rocky to hold an impression, then reappeared a few steps later, precise as before. Once, I stopped and watched the trail ahead for movement. Nothing crossed my view. The trees stood rigid. The light filtered down flat and gray. The quiet deepened as the day wore on. December afternoons shortened without warning. Shadows stretched early, filling the low spots between trunks. I felt exposed not because of what I saw, but because of what I did not. No signs of animals, no scat, no disturbed brush. The forest felt paused, like it was holding something back. I reached the overlook just before sunset. The valley below lay dull and pale, the river a narrow ribbon of steel. I should have turned around then. I knew that. Instead, I stayed longer than necessary, letting the cold settle into my legs, letting doubt chew at me. I wanted to see if the tracks would appear beside me again when I stopped moving. They did. The second set closed the distance until the toe marks sat almost on top of mine. They ended 3 feet behind where I stood. No scuffing, No sign of a stop or a turn. Just a sudden halt, as if whoever made them had decided that was close enough. That was when I heard the breathing. It came from uphill, slow and measured, matching the rise and fall of my own chest. Not loud enough to echo, not soft enough to dismiss. Each inhale sounded wet, controlled. Each exhale carried weight, like air pushed through a narrow space. I did not turn. I counted my breaths instead, trying to change the rhythm to see if the sound followed. It did. When I slowed, it slowed. When I sped up, it stayed with me. I walked back down without running. Panic would have burned energy I needed. I kept my pace steady and my eyes forward. The breathing stayed uphill, always just out of sight, never closing the distance, never falling behind. The tracks appeared beside mine again, fresh and sharp, even where the snow had been crushed flat by my earlier steps. Dusk collapsed into night faster than I expected. The temperature dropped hard. Frost formed on my sleeves. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the trees, and beyond it everything felt close and crowded. The breathing continued until the trail leveled out near the road. Then it stopped. No fade. No retreat. Just absence. I broke into a jog for the last stretch. The parking lot came into view. My truck sitting alone under a skin of frost. Relief hit me so fast it made my hands shake. I unlocked the door, dropped my pack inside, and paused with one hand on the hood. The metal was warm. Not from the engine. I had been gone for hours. The warmth spread across the center of the hood, uneven, like a body had leaned there recently, forearms braced, weight pressing down. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my pants without thinking. The air around the truck felt disturbed, as if someone had just stepped away. I circled the vehicle with my light. No footprints led to it. None left it. The snow around the tires was untouched except for my own. The gate at the road remained open, chains still frozen in place. I drove home without stopping. The heater blasted full, but the warmth took time to reach my bones. That night, I went over every detail, every rational angle. Someone could have followed me. A hunter out late. A drifter using the closed trail. The breathing could have been my own, amplified by fear and terrain. The warmth on the hood could have come from the engine retaining heat in the cold air, uneven cooling creating the illusion of pressure. Those explanations held until I returned a week later. During daylight with fresh snow on the ground, I stayed by the truck. I watched the trailhead for hours. No one came, no one left. The snow remained unbroken. I never went back onto the trail. I did not need to prove anything anymore. I understood what had happened. Someone had been there with me, close enough to follow my steps exactly, careful enough to avoid being seen, patient enough to wait. The forest had not been wrong. It had been occupied. We booked it cheap because it was off-season. The listing sat ignored on a rental site, buried under newer photos and summer reviews. The owner answered emails late at night and warned us in clipped sentences that the pipes froze sometimes and that cell service dropped without notice. He added that winter guests needed to be comfortable handling small problems on their own. That should have ended it. Instead, the low price and the promise of quiet won. December pressed down hard that year. The drive took longer than planned because the sun dropped early and the last stretch of road turned from pavement to packed dirt, and then to uneven gravel. Snow sat in shallow drifts along the shoulders, old snow compressed into gray sheets by passing tires. Trees closed in on both sides, tall and bare, their branches crossing overhead in places like ribs. The GPS lost accuracy miles back, jumping the arrow sideways and then freezing. We followed the rental instructions instead, counting turns and mile markers, slowing each time the road split or dipped. The cabin stood alone in a clearing that looked scraped out of the forest. No neighboring lights. No tracks except a single narrow drive leading to the door. The building itself was small, one story, built from dark logs that absorbed what little light remained. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. The place felt shut down, waiting. Cold hit hard once the engine turned off. The quiet felt heavy, the kind that pushes in on the ears. Snow squeaked under boots. The front porch sagged slightly near the steps, boards stiff with age. The lock resisted, then gave way with a dull click. Inside smelled like old wood dust, and something damp that never quite dried. The air held still. It took time for our breath to stop fogging the room. The cabin had one main space with a small kitchen pushed against the back wall, a table near the window, a couch that faced a stone fireplace, and a cast-iron stove set slightly off-center. 2 bedrooms sat down a short hall, along with a narrow bathroom. Everything looked clean but unused, as if someone had wiped surfaces without moving anything. A calendar hung on the wall, still turned to March from years earlier. No updates, no notes. We dropped bags and started the usual routine of checking heat, water, and lights. The heater kicked on after a delay, rattling and then settling into a steady hum. Water ran slow but clear. Lights worked. Relief settled in. The sense of isolation softened enough to feel manageable. On the table near the window sat a thick guest book. The cover had curled at the edges, the leather cracked. Pages bulged from years of entries. We flipped through out of habit, scanning notes about weather, fishing, summer hikes. Most entries were dated years back, clustered around warmer months. Toward the end, pages thinned out. The last entry stood alone, written in a careful hand, dated 3 winters earlier. It mentioned scratching in the walls after dark and joked about mice until the tone shifted. The writer noted that it did not sound like mice. The entry ended without explanation. No signature beyond a first name. We closed the book and left it there. The stove needed time to heat, so we gathered kindling from a bin outside. Snow clung to gloves and melted into dark spots on the floor. As the room warmed, the cabin creaked and popped, wood adjusting to heat after a long cold stretch. Those sounds felt normal, expected. Night arrived fully not long after. Darkness pressed up against the windows, thick and complete. The forest beyond might as well not exist. The stove glowed dull red at the edges. The heater cycled on and off. We ate simple food and moved around the cabin, unpacking, settling in. The earlier tension faded into a quiet awareness of place. The scratching started after the dishes were done. At first it registered as part of the background noise. Another small sound layered under the rest. It came from behind the stove, slow and uneven, like something dragging along the wood. The sound paused, then resumed, patient, deliberate. It was not loud. It did not rush. It moved a few inches at a time. We stood still without planning to. The sound continued, steady enough to count the intervals. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. The stove blocked any view of the wall behind it. The noise stayed low, close to the floor. Rodents made sense. Old cabins attracted them. Winter drove them inside. Still, this did not sound frantic or light. It carried weight. We tapped the side of the stove with a poker, a sharp metal sound meant to scare off anything hiding nearby. The scratching stopped. The silence afterward felt too complete. The heater shut off. The fire crackled once and settled. No movement followed. We told ourselves it was nothing. The guest book entry felt less amusing now, but still explainable. Later, as we prepared for bed, the power cut out. The lights blinked once and went dark. The heater died with a click. The stove continued to glow faintly, but the room dropped into shadow. Outside, no moon showed through the clouds. Darkness filled the cabin in thick layers. We stood still again, listening. Wind brushed the walls. The trees creaked. Nothing else moved. We found flashlights in our bags and turned them on. Narrow beams cut through the room, catching dust in the air. That was when the handprints appeared. They were on the inside of the front window, smeared across the glass. Muddy, full palm impressions with clear finger marks. They sat at chest height, spaced as if someone had placed both hands flat against the pane. The prints faced inward. The fingers pointed toward the room. The mud looked fresh, still damp in places, streaked slightly where it had slid on the cold glass. No matching footprints showed on the porch outside. Snow remained smooth, untouched. The beam moved to the side window. More prints there, lower this time, smaller hands pressed hard enough to leave full shapes. Smears marked where palms had shifted. The flashlight shook despite effort to hold it steady. We checked the back window. Nothing there. The bathroom window showed one partial print, fingertips only, as if someone had reached up and failed to get leverage. No sound followed. No movement outside. The forest stayed black and silent. We moved through the cabin, checking locks. The door remained bolted. The windows were sealed shut, frost lining the edges. No sign of forced entry. The scratching did not return. The power outage stretched on. The stove still gave some heat, but the room cooled steadily. We pulled coats back on and sat near the fire, lights off to save batteries. Every sound sharpened. The wind shifted. Snow slid from branches. Time slowed. Sleep did not come. The idea of lying down felt wrong, like giving up attention. We kept flashlights close and watched the dark corners of the room. The scratching never returned. The handprints stayed where they were, drying into lighter streaks as the mud lost moisture. Hours passed that way. Cold crept back and around the edges. At some point the fire burned low enough that we fed it again. Sparks jumped and died. Outside the wind dropped. Silence deepened. Before dawn we decided to leave. Packing took minutes. Movement stayed careful, quiet. Flashlights guided the way. We avoided the windows. When the door opened, cold rushed in, sharp and clean. The sky showed the first hint of gray. Snow reflected what little light there was. The porch remained empty. No tracks led up to the door beyond our own. The drive looked the same as when we arrived, smooth and unbroken. We loaded the car and pulled away slowly, tires crunching over packed snow. The road curved back toward the trees. As the cabin disappeared behind us, relief should have followed. Instead, a new tension settled in. The road behind us showed tire tracks, only ours. No other marks cut through the snow. No signs of another vehicle arriving or leaving. The handprints had no source we could see. The scratching had no clear cause. The guest book entry felt heavier now, less like a joke and more like a warning left behind without explanation. As daylight grew, the forest looked ordinary again. Trees spaced out, snow clean and pale. The road eventually met pavement, then plowed lanes, then cell service returned without ceremony. Messages came through all at once, breaking the quiet. Later, after the heater thawed hands and coffee steadied nerves, we made sense of it piece by piece. The scratching behind the stove came from expansion and contraction, wood rubbing against nails, mice moving through walls. Old buildings made sounds that felt intentional when the mind had searched for patterns. The power outage traced back to a line down by snow, confirmed by a brief notice online. The handprints took longer to explain, but the answer arrived with uncomfortable clarity. The cabin owner had mentioned frozen pipes. Someone checked on the place in winter, probably a local hired to make rounds after storms. Mud on boots from a thawed patch near the road. Gloves pulled off inside to work on the sink. Hands pressed against the window to look out into the dark, checking the weather before stepping back outside. The prints faced inward, because the person stood inside when they made them. No footprints remained because new snow fell afterward, light and steady through the night, covering everything evenly. By morning, only our tracks cut through it, fresh and clear. The guest book entry likely came from another winter visitor who heard the same sounds, saw something they could not place in the dark, and left without answers. Fear filled the gaps that logic later closed. The explanation settled into place, solid and complete. Nothing followed us home. No lingering sense of being watched. Just the memory of how easily isolation and cold sharpen the mind. How darkness reshapes ordinary details into threats, and how real fear can grow without anything unreal to support it. We did not return. The listing stayed online. The warnings remained buried. The cabin waited through another winter, quiet, unchanged, holding its scratches and its prints, ready to let the next off-season guest fill in the rest. I took the overnight shift because December bills did not care how tired I was. The plant paid time and a half after midnight, and the supervisor needed someone reliable to watch the intake while the river dropped and the temperature stayed below freezing. I had worked the place for years. I knew the smell of oil and wet concrete. I knew how the building settled when the heaters kicked on. I knew the way fog slid off the river and hugged the lower yard, thick enough to dull the sodium lights and make everything feel farther away than it was. The plant sat low because it had to. The intake pipes reached straight into the river, through a concrete channel with steel grates and valves that controlled flow to the pumps. In summer, the water ran clear enough to see rocks and weeds. In winter, it turned black and heavy. Fog rolled in most nights after sunset and stayed until morning. That night, the fog was so dense it pressed against the windows like a wall. The yard lights made pale cones that stopped short, leaving everything else swallowed. The first hours passed slow. I walked my rounds, checked gauges, logged numbers, drank coffee that tasted like cardboard. The heaters rattled. The river murmured behind the building, steady and close. Around 1 in the morning, the alarms went off. Not one, but several. Pressure drops that did not fit any pattern I knew. The intake gauge fell and rose in short jumps. The pump amperage flickered. That kind of thing happened with ice buildup or debris, but the swings were wrong. Too quick. Too uneven. I reset the alarms and watched the screen. The pressure dipped again. I pulled on my jacket and headed out to the intake channel. The door to the yard stuck from the cold. When it opened, the fog poured in. It smelled like river mud and rust. The ground was slick with frost. My boots made dull crunches on gravel that sounded too loud. The intake channel sat a few yards from the building. The water moved fast there, pulled by the pumps. The surface looked like dark glass with pale steam lifting off it. I leaned over the railing and shined my light across the grates. Leaves and sticks clung to the bars. That was normal. I took the rake from its hook and dragged it across the metal, clearing what I could reach. The pressure should have steadied. It did not. I shined the light farther out, following the current. That was when I saw movement. Not the random roll of debris or the flat slide of ice. Something long shifted just under the surface. It moved against the current, slow and deliberate, then stopped. The water bulged around it, smooth and high. My light caught a shape that did not reflect like wood. It held a line for a moment, then sank and vanished. I stood there longer than I should have. The cold worked its way through my gloves. I told myself it was a log pinned by the current, or a mat of weeds turning end over end. Rivers carried all kinds of things in winter. I went back inside and watched the gauges. The pressure climbed, then dropped again. The alarms tripped a second time. I headed back out. The fog felt thicker, heavier, as if the air had weight. The channel sounded different. The water slapped the concrete walls harder. I cleared the grates again. My light skimmed the surface. Nothing moved. The pressure rose and held. I logged the event and tried to settle back into the routine. An hour later, I smelled river water inside the building. Not the usual dampness, but a fresh, cold smell like rain on stone. I followed it toward the control room. That was when I saw the footprints. They came from the direction of the intake door. They were wet, dark ovals on the concrete floor, spaced like a careful walk. They were larger than mine. The pattern was wrong for boots. The edges were smooth, like rubber soles without tread. Water pooled in the heel marks. The trail ended at the control room door. I stood still and listened. The plant made its normal sounds. Pumps thumped. Air hissed through vents, nothing else moved. I checked the intake door. It was closed. The handle was wet. Water dripped from it and made a small shining line down the paint. I wiped my hand on my jacket and tried the handle. The door did not open. It had been locked from inside earlier. Like always. The lock engaged. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I walked the rest of the building, room by room, checking every corner. The locker room was empty. The maintenance bay held only tools and a forklift parked where it belonged. The storage room smelled of chemicals and dust. No one hid behind tanks or pallets. The cameras showed fog and empty rooms. The footprints remained the only sign. I went back to the intake channel with the radio clipped to my jacket. The fog had thinned enough to show the river's edge. Ice skimmed the slower water near the bank. I shined my light along the concrete wall. Something scraped below the surface. The pressure gauge dipped again. I leaned over the railing and saw the shape return. It rose higher this time, close enough to see texture. It was not alive in the way I had imagined. It was a bundle of river trash bound together, long boards and plastic sheeting wrapped tight with rope and wire. It had been shaped by the current into something tall and narrow, heavy enough to push against the flow. A crude drag anchor hung from one end, a length of chain snagging the grates and pulling the bundle into place. I understood then why the pressure behaved the way it did. Someone had been working the intake, forcing the pumps to pull harder, then letting go. Someone had been in the water. I backed away and checked the yard again. The fog shifted and opened toward the riverbank. I saw a dark form there, low and still, half hidden by reeds. I kept my light steady and moved closer. It was a person. The man wore chest waders and a heavy coat soaked through. His face was pale and slack. His eyes stared past me at nothing. One hand still clutched the rope that ran into the water toward the intake. His boots matched the footprints inside. He had tried to reach the control room, likely to shut the pumps off after something went wrong. The cold had taken him before he got the door open. Later, after the police and the plant manager arrived, the story came together piece by piece. The man had been living near the river, sleeping under the bridge downstream. He had scoped the plant for weeks, watching shifts and routines. He knew enough to think he could divert water or damage equipment for scrap or leverage. He built the bundle to choke the intake and force a shutdown. The river fought him. The pumps pulled harder than he expected. He got caught in the current and dragged against the concrete. By the time he crawled out and staggered inside, his hands were numb and his legs useless. He made it to the door and left his mark on the handle. He did not make it farther. The alarms made sense after that. The movement in the water had been the bundle shifting and the man fighting the current. The footprints were real as the river's smell on the floor. Nothing about that night needed anything beyond cold, water, and a bad plan carried out by someone who underestimated both. When my shift ended, the fog lifted with the sun. The river looked ordinary again, brown and slow. The intake grates were clear. The plant hummed the way it always did. I drove home with the overtime logged, and the image of wet footprints fixed in my mind. A reminder of how thin the line is between routine and disaster when winter settles in, and the river keeps moving no matter what anyone plans. We went because it was tradition, and tradition has weight. It pulls harder than weather reports, harder than common sense. Every December, just after the first hard freeze, before Christmas lights went up and before work shut down, we rode the North Loop. It was a long oval of Forest Service trails and frozen water, nothing marked for tourists, nothing advertised. The lakes locked early in that region, shallow and wind-scarred, and the cold settled fast. The snow there was not the soft kind that piles up in postcards. It was thin, wind-packed, sharp with ice underneath. Perfect for speed, perfect for machines. We had done it every year since our early 20s. Same machines, same gear, same route. It was a way of marking time. No pictures. No stories told to others. Just the ride, the noise, the cold pressing through layers. The sense of moving fast through a place that felt empty in winter. That year was no different at the start. We unloaded at the same pullout. The same crooked sign half buried by plow berms. The same quiet road that never saw traffic once the snow came. The sun was low even though it was early afternoon. December light does not rise so much as it leaks into the sky. The temperature was well below freezing, the kind of cold that tightens skin and makes plastic brittle. The machines complained at first, metal ticking, belts stiff. We waited like we always did, helmets off, breath rising, watching the forest. Spruce and fir, packed tight, dark even in daylight. The snow between trunks looked blue, almost black. Nothing moved, no birds, no wind. That stillness always came before the engines took over. He went ahead of me once we were rolling. That was normal. He liked setting the pace, liked being first to cut a line. I followed at a distance where I could see his track clearly, could read his choices in the snow. He rode clean. No wasted movement. The trail curved along a low ridge, and then dropped toward the first lake. The lake was wide, flat, already swept clean by wind. You could see the ice through the snow in places, thick and dull, cracked in long white lines that had frozen solid weeks earlier. We crossed without stopping. The ice hummed under the skis, a deep sound that traveled up through the machine and into the body. On the far side, the trail narrowed and climbed back into trees. That stretch was slower, tighter, roots frozen under snow, corners blind. I kept him in sight, his taillight bobbing between trunks, red against green and white. The bend where he vanished was not sharp. It was a gentle curve around a stand of young spruce. I could still see the trail beyond it. That is what stayed with me. The sightline did not end. The snowmobile did not slow or tip or slide. 1 second the light was there, the next it was not, and there was no sound change to match it. No crash, no sudden rev, just absence. I eased off and rolled forward, expecting to see him stop just past the curve, adjusting a glove or checking something minor. The trail ahead was empty. The snow was unbroken except for his track, which ended abruptly near the trees. His machine lay on its side 10 feet off the trail, engine running, track spinning uselessly, chewing snow into a low ridge behind it. Steam rose where heat met cold air. The smell of exhaust hung thick and sharp. I shut my engine down and the quiet hit hard. The forest closed in around that small mechanical noise still coming from his machine. I righted it and killed the engine. The silence afterward was deeper. I looked for him then. I scanned the trees, the ground, the trail. There was no sign of a fall, no scuff marks where a body might have rolled. No broken branches at eye level. No blood. No hat or glove or scrap of fabric. Just the snow, smooth and undisturbed, except for one thing. From the spot where his track ended, there was a long indentation leading into the trees. It was not a set of footprints. It was not a drag mark like something pulled forward. It was wide, shallow, pressed down in a way that suggested weight distributed across a broad surface. The snow there was crushed and slightly melted, then refrozen, even though only minutes had passed. The mark ran straight for several yards, then disappeared among the trunks where the snow was deeper and uneven. I followed it on foot, leaving my own prints, feeling the cold creep up through my boots. The indentation did not match anything I knew. It was too wide for skis, too smooth for branches being dragged. There were no handprints, no signs of struggle. It looked as if something heavy had been pulled backward, away from the trail into cover, with no resistance. That thought came uninvited and would not leave. I called his name once, then again louder, my voice flat in the cold air. The sound did not carry far. Trees swallow noise in winter. I listened for movement, for breath, for anything. Nothing answered. The forest stayed still. Time began to slip then, stretching thin. I checked my watch and could not remember what the numbers meant. I moved farther into the trees, circling, searching, careful not to stray too far and lose the trail. The snow grew deeper fast, up to my knees, making progress slow. I looked for tracks, any sign of passage. There were none. The indentation faded into nothing, as if whatever caused it had lifted away. I went back to the machines and restarted mine, riding slowly along the trail in both directions, scanning for signs he might have gone ahead or doubled back. There were none. His track did not continue past the bend. It simply stopped. The cold began to work on me then. Not just on skin but deeper. The realization settled that something had gone very wrong in a place that offered no help. I made the decision to leave and get assistance, marking the spot in my mind, in the GPS we carried, in the shape of the trees. I rode hard back to the truck, the forest blurring past, the trail familiar yet wrong now. Search and rescue arrived hours later after dark. Headlamps and snowshoes, radios crackling, breath fogging. They worked methodically, grid patterns, probes, dogs brought in the next morning. They checked the ice, drilled holes, measured thickness. They checked weather records, wind chill, exposure time. They talked about thin ice, even though the lake we crossed was known to freeze early and hard. They talked about hypothermia, disorientation, paradoxical undressing, all the standard explanations that fit most winter losses. They asked about alcohol, about arguments, about risk-taking. I answered everything plainly. None of it matched what I had seen. They found nothing, no body, no gear, no trace beyond that indentation, which by then had softened and filled in under fresh snow. After days, they scaled back. After weeks, they stopped. Paperwork replaced searching. The forest returned to its own order. I went back once with them and then alone later, standing at the bend, looking into the trees. Without fresh snow, the place looked ordinary. The trail curved, the spruce stood close, the ground rose gently. There was nowhere a person could vanish without leaving a sign. That was the problem. That was always the problem. Life moved on because it had to. The tradition ended. The machines sat unused for a season, then were sold. December came and went. The first year after, I stayed away from the area entirely. The second year, I moved farther south. Still, winter followed. It was the third December when I heard it for the first time. I was staying in a small cabin not far from the old trail, helping a friend with maintenance work. The night was clear and cold, stars sharp, the kind of night where sound travels. I woke to the unmistakable whine of a snowmobile engine, distant but clear, moving through the forest. It was late, well past any reasonable riding hour, and there were no marked trails near the cabin. I listened, heart beating hard, as the sound passed from left to right, then faded. I told myself it was someone on a distant road, sound bending in the cold air. That explanation held until it happened again the next night, and the next. Each time the engine noise followed a similar path, always at night, always steady, never stopping. It did not rev or slow for terrain. It did not echo the way sound does when it moves along open ice. It moved through trees where no trail existed, where machines could not go without cutting. There were no fresh tracks in the morning. No sign anyone had been there. I began to pay attention to conditions when it happened. Clear nights, heavy cold, high pressure. Sound carries farther under those circumstances. Inversions form, trapping noise and bending it downward. Engines from miles away can seem close, moving where they are not. Snowmobile clubs run groomers at night sometimes, far off, maintaining trails. The sound of a groomer is deep and steady, like a distant aircraft. It can seem to travel sideways, even backward, depending on terrain and air layers. That explanation made sense. It had to. I researched it, read about acoustic shadow zones, about how frozen ground reflects sound. I convinced myself that what I heard was ordinary physics layered over memory and grief. For a while, that worked. Then I started hearing it closer. Not louder, but nearer, as if passing just beyond the tree line. I stepped outside one night, boots crunching on snow, breath loud in my ears, and listened. The engine noise was there, off to the north, moving parallel to the cabin. I followed it a short distance, stopping often, noting how it shifted when I moved. It remained consistent, indifferent to my position. That suggested distance, not proximity. I went back inside and checked maps, tracing possible trail networks that could produce that sound. There were none aligned the way the noise moved. The nearest groomed trail ran east, west, miles away. The road was plowed but saw little traffic at night, and trucks did not sound like that. Snowmobiles require snow. And there was no continuous snow cover connecting those distant trails to this area. The sound stopped abruptly that night, cutting off as if a switch had been thrown. The silence afterward felt heavy, pressing. I slept poorly. In the years since, I have heard it many times, always in December, always under similar conditions. I have never heard it in January or February, when snow is deeper and riding more common. I have never heard it during daylight. It never changes pitch or pattern. It never approaches directly or recedes naturally. It moves along that same invisible line, through forest and over terrain that should alter sound but does not. I returned to the bend once more alone, years after the search ended. The trail was overgrown then, less used. Snow covered everything evenly. I stood where his track ended and listened. The forest was quiet. No engines, no wind. I walked into the trees, following the direction of that old indentation, stopping where it had faded. I dug down through the snow to the frozen ground. There was nothing there, no depression, no sign of disturbance preserved beneath layers. Whatever happened left no lasting mark. I spent hours there, mapping the area, pacing distances, noting slopes and drainage. I looked for natural features that could explain a sudden disappearance. A sinkhole, a hidden ravine, a patch of thin ice disguised by snow. There were none close enough. The ground fell away gradually. The ice on nearby water was thick and uniform. A person could not simply be taken by the land without a trace. The explanation that fits best is still the one search and rescue offered, stripped of its weak points and rebuilt. A sudden medical event, a stumble, a moment of disorientation. A fall into a hidden pocket of thin ice near the shore, perhaps where water flowed under snow, creating a weak spot. The machine could have tipped as he dismounted, idling while he moved forward. The indentation could have been his body, being pulled backward by current under ice, though that would usually leave broken edges, watermarks, something. Animals could have interfered later, scattering remains beyond recognition, though that too leaves signs. None of these explanations satisfy fully, but they exist within the bounds of what the world does. They do not require anything beyond cold, water, and chance. As for the engines at night, I have settled on sound. Not just any sound, but a specific one, carried under specific conditions, from a specific place. There is a maintenance facility far north of the old trail, one not marked on recreational maps. They service heavy equipment there in winter, running engines late to keep them from freezing. On clear, cold nights, with the right pressure, that sound travels along the valley and bends through the forest, following the shape of the land. It aligns, by coincidence or by geometry, with the path of the old trail where I last saw him. My mind fills in the rest. I do not go north in December anymore. I do not ride. Tradition loses its grip when it costs too much. Still, when the cold settles early and the lakes freeze hard, when the nights go quiet and the air turns sharp, I sometimes wake and listen. If I hear engines where no trails exist, I remind myself of physics, of distance, of the way memory sharpens certain sounds and dulls others. I remind myself that the world does not owe explanations that feel complete. What happened that day was real. The empty trail, the idling machine, the mark in the snow. Those things do not change. The rest is what remains after. The long work of fitting loss into a shape that can be carried. We went exploring because we were bored and home from college, back in our parents' houses with too much free time and nowhere to put it. Finals had ended early that year, and December felt stretched thin, gray and quiet. The town looked smaller every time I came back. Stores closed before dark. Snow sat in patches along the roads where plows missed. People stayed inside. That church sat at the edge of town like it always had, empty and forgotten, and we had passed it 100 times without stopping. Someone mentioned it casually one night, not as a challenge or a dare, just as something to do. I agreed without thinking much about it. The building stood off the old county road behind a line of leafless trees. The parking lot had cracked asphalt with weeds frozen in place. Snow had drifted unevenly across it, thin enough to see the blacktop through it. The steeple leaned slightly, something I had never noticed before. One of the stained glass windows on the side was broken and boarded over from the inside. The rest were intact, dusty and dark. No cars. No tracks except ours when we parked and walked up. The front doors were heavy wood, painted white long ago. The paint had peeled into long curls. One door sagged lower than the other. When we pushed them open, they moved easily, no resistance. No sound except old hinges complaining. Cold air rolled out from inside, sharper than outside, with the smell of damp wood and stone. I expected debris, trash, maybe spray paint. I did not expect light. Candles burned along the center aisle. Not melted down stubs or random leftovers, but full candles, straight, evenly spaced, each one set in a simple holder. The flames were steady. The wax was clean and pale. There were no puddles beneath them. The light they gave off was soft and warm, wrong for a place that was supposed to be empty. The pews were dusty but arranged neatly. The altar cloth was gone, but the table beneath it had been wiped clean recently. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something like soap. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear yet, more like confusion. Someone had been there. Someone had taken care of the place enough to light candles and clean surfaces. There were no coats hanging anywhere, no bags, no shoes by the door. No signs of anyone leaving in a hurry, just quiet and candlelight. We moved slowly, careful not to touch anything. The floorboards creaked in specific places, a pattern that suggested regular foot traffic. I noticed a thin trail of melted snow near the side wall, already drying. It led toward a narrow staircase that climbed to the balcony. The steps were steep and worn in the center. The railing was smooth from years of hands sliding along it. Upstairs, the balcony ran the width of the room. Old hymn books sat stacked near the back wall, their covers faded, pages stiff. Dust coated the rail overlooking the sanctuary, except for a few clear patches where someone had rested their hands recently. From above, the candles looked even more deliberate, placed with care. The flames flickered slightly as cold air shifted through the building. That was when the front doors slammed. The sound was violent, a sharp crack of wood hitting wood, followed by a deeper thud as the doors settled into place. The air pressure changed. The candles trembled but stayed lit. A second sound followed, slower and deliberate, metal sliding into metal. Then another, and another, bolts, heavy ones. The noise carried clearly through the open space, echoing off the walls. I froze where I stood. The cold from the floor crept up through my shoes. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. No one laughed. No one moved. The building felt smaller, tighter, like the air had thickened. More metal slid into place. A final scrape, silence. We waited. Time stretched thin. I counted the seconds without meaning to, then lost track. The candles burned steadily below us, wax beginning to drip now, forming thin, uneven lines down their sides. The smell of smoke grew stronger. Eventually we moved, slowly, quietly, staying close to the walls. The staircase groaned when we went down. Each sound felt exposed. The front doors were shut tight. Thick wooden bars sat in iron brackets across them, freshly placed. The wood pale and clean compared to the older surfaces around it. The brackets were bolted into the wall. Not nailed. Bolted. The side doors were the same. Every exit we tried had been secured from the inside. The windows were tall and narrow, most of them too high to reach without climbing. The boarded window on the side was sealed tight, screws sunk deep into the wood. Panic came in waves. It pressed against my ribs and then receded, leaving my hands shaking. The logic part of my mind tried to keep up. Someone had been inside before us. Someone knew the building well. Someone had waited. We moved to the far side of the sanctuary, where a row of shorter windows sat above a storage area. One of them had a cracked pane. The frame was rotting at the bottom. We dragged a small table over, its legs scraping loudly across the floor. The sound echoed, but nothing answered it. Forcing the window took time. The wood resisted, splintering slowly. My fingers burned from the cold air pouring in. When it finally gave way, the glass cracked further, then broke inward. Shards fell onto the floor, sharp and loud. I pushed the rest out carefully, clearing enough space to climb through. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of snow and pine. I leaned out first, scanning the ground. What I saw made my stomach drop. Footprints circled the building. They formed a wide loop around the church, pressed deep into the snow. Clear and deliberate. They stopped at every window, including the one we were climbing through. Some sets overlapped. Some crossed back over themselves. All of them faced inward. None of them matched the size or tread of our shoes. They were heavier, deeper, with a wide heel and narrow toe. Boots meant for work, not walking around town. I climbed out and turned slowly, forcing myself to look carefully. The tracks were fresh. Snow had not drifted into them yet. They led away toward the tree line, then disappeared where the ground dropped toward the creek. There were no vehicle tracks, no signs of a struggle, just the loop patient and complete. We moved fast after that. No running until we reached the car. The doors unlocked with a sharp beep that sounded too loud. My hands shook as I started the engine. The heater took too long to warm up. I kept looking in the mirrors, expecting movement that never came. We did not call the police that night. None of us wanted to explain why we had been there. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound outside my parents' house pulled me awake. The explanation came days later, quietly, without drama. The church was not as abandoned as everyone thought. A man had been using it for months, maybe longer. He was a former maintenance worker who had lost his job when the building closed. He still had keys. He still felt responsible for it. He lit candles because the electricity had been shut off, and he did not like the dark. He cleaned because he hated seeing the place decay. He stayed out of sight because he did not want trouble. When he saw the car in the lot, he panicked. He did not know who we were. He assumed we were there to vandalize or steal. He waited until we were upstairs, then barred the doors, thinking he could scare us into leaving through a window and never coming back. He circled the building to make sure there were no other exits we could use. The footprints were his alone. He was arrested for unlawful confinement and trespassing. No one was hurt. The candles were confiscated. The building was finally boarded up properly, sold the next spring. I still think about the sound of those bolts sliding into place. Not because it was mysterious, but because it was intentional. Someone made a decision in that moment. Someone chose to lock other people inside a building in winter, and hoped fear would do the rest. That knowledge stayed with me longer than anything else from that night. I left later than I planned. Work ran long, and by the time I finished packing the car, the sky had already gone flat and gray, the kind of winter sky that feels low enough to touch. I was driving to see family for Christmas, a trip I had done many times before. 4 hours if I stayed on the main roads. 5 if traffic turned bad. I wanted to make good time. Wanted to get there before dark. Wanted to feel like the drive was already behind me. The forecast called for snow, but nothing unusual. Light accumulation. Flurries turning heavier overnight. December had been mild so far, and I trusted the road crews. I trusted my car. I trusted the navigation app on my phone because I always did. The first hour went smoothly. The highway was dry, the air cold but calm. The radio faded in and out as I moved farther from the city. Pine trees replaced strip malls. Gas stations grew farther apart. I stopped once to fill the tank, even though it was still half full. Old habit from winter driving. I bought a coffee I barely drank and used the bathroom just to stretch my legs. I remember thinking that the night felt quiet in a way that only happens before heavy snow. Not long after getting back on the road, my phone chimed and the map shifted. A blue line bent away from the highway, shaving nearly 40 minutes off the drive. A shortcut. The screen showed a county road cutting through forest and farmland, then reconnecting farther north. I glanced at the time. The sky was already dark. I did not want to arrive close to midnight. I told myself it was a simple choice. I turned off the highway and onto a narrower road. At first it felt fine. The pavement was clean, the edges marked by low snowbanks and reflectors. Houses sat back from the road with porch lights glowing faintly. The snow began as small grains, tapping the windshield like sand. The wipers handled it easily. 10 minutes in, the houses thinned out. Fields opened on either side, flat and white, broken by fence lines buried to their rails. The snow grew heavier, thicker flakes falling straight down. The road narrowed again, no shoulder now, just packed snow beyond the edge of the asphalt. The reflectors were spaced farther apart. I slowed without thinking about it. The navigation voice did not warn me. It never does. It just shows the line and counts down the minutes. Another turn. This one sharper. The road dipped slightly and then rose. Trees closed in. Tall, dark shapes crowded both sides, branches heavy with snow. The beam of my headlights caught the flakes and turned them into a moving wall. I turned the radio off. I wanted to hear the tires. The road surface changed without warning. One moment the tires hummed on pavement. The next they slid on packed snow. I felt the steering wheel go light in my hands. I eased off the gas and held the wheel steady. The car corrected itself, but the message was clear. This road was not getting plowed often. I considered turning around. I looked at the map. The shortcut had already saved me time. Going back would mean retracing miles through snow that was getting worse by the minute. I told myself the road would open up again soon. I told myself the trees meant shelter from the wind. I told myself many things. The snow started coming sideways. Wind pushed it through the trees and across the road in sheets. My headlights showed only what was directly in front of the car. Everything else was swallowed by white and black. I slowed more, my hands tight on the wheel. I kept the car in the tracks of whoever had passed before me, though those tracks were already filling in. Then the road narrowed again. It curved slightly left, then right, then straightened for a short stretch before dropping downhill. At the bottom of the dip, the car lost traction. The back end slid first, gentle at first, then sharper. I countersteered, but the tires had nothing to bite into. The car drifted toward the right edge, toward the trees. It stopped with a soft thump, not a crash. The front wheels buried themselves in a drift that had formed along the tree line. The engine stalled. Snow fell onto the hood and filled the space between the windshield and the wipers. I sat there with my hands still on the wheel, breathing hard. The silence felt heavy. No other cars passed. No lights appeared behind me. The wind moved through the trees with a low, steady sound. I tried restarting the engine. It turned over and caught, then died again when I tried to move. The wheels spun and threw snow. I stopped before I dug myself in deeper. I got out to look. The cold hit me immediately. The air smelled sharp and clean. Snow soaked into my shoes as soon as my feet hit the ground. The car was angled slightly toward the trees, nose buried, rear still on the road. The snowbank was deeper than it looked from inside. I could see where the plow had pushed snow weeks ago, and where fresh drifts had piled on top of it. I checked my phone. No service. The screen showed nothing but the time and a faint glow. I walked a short distance up the road, hoping for a bar, a signal, anything. Nothing changed. The trees pressed close, their trunks dark and close together. The road ahead disappeared into falling snow. I went back to the car. I cleared snow from the exhaust with my hands. Brushing until I could see the metal, I made sure the tailpipe was open. I started the engine again and let it idle. Warm air slowly filled the cabin. The windows fogged slightly, then cleared. I weighed my options. Walking was not one of them. I did not know how far I was from the next house or town. The snow was coming down hard. The road was empty. Staying with the car was the only choice that made sense. I called family even though I knew it would not go through. I sent a message that did not send. I turned the phone off to save battery. I adjusted the seat and pulled my coat tighter around me. I kept the engine running for a while, then turned it off to save fuel. I planned to cycle it. 15 minutes on, 30 off. That was the advice I remembered. Time moved strangely. The dark outside the windows felt solid like a wall. Snow tapped and slid down the glass. The wind rose and fell. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, waking each time the cold crept too far in. At some point before dawn, something touched the car. At first it felt like the wind, a gentle rocking motion, slow and deliberate. The car shifted slightly on its suspension, just enough to wake me fully. I sat up, heart racing, listening. The engine was off. The only sound was the wind and my own breathing. The rocking stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Branches sometimes brushed the car when the wind gusted, but this felt different. The movement had weight behind it. I made a sound without thinking, a sharp shout meant to scare whatever was there. The word did not matter. The noise was the point. Everything went still. The silence stretched. Snow continued to fall. My breath sounded loud in the small space. I stayed quiet after that. I did not move. I did not reach for the door or the phone. I just listened. The rocking started again. It was slow and steady, not violent, not aggressive. The car shifted slightly from side to side, the suspension creaking softly. The motion felt like something testing the car, leaning against it, pulling back, then leaning again. Snow slid off the roof in soft sheets. I held my breath. I did not make a sound. The rocking continued, unbroken by my silence. It felt methodical, patient. I risked a glance through the windshield. Snow clung to the glass, but near the top, where the heat from earlier had cleared it, the glass fogged suddenly. A wide bloom of condensation spread downward from above, slow and heavy, as if warm air was being blown directly onto it. The fog thickened, then faded slightly, then thickened again in a rhythm that matched breathing. I stayed frozen, eyes fixed on that patch of glass. I did not think in words. I did not imagine shapes or faces. I only registered the fact of it, something tall enough to reach the top of the windshield. Something warm, something close. After a long time, the rocking eased. The pressure lifted. The fog thinned and disappeared as the cold reclaimed the glass. The car settled back into stillness. I did not move for the rest of the night. When light finally crept into the trees, it felt unreal. The world outside the car turned from black to gray to a dull blue. Snow still fell, but lighter now, drifting instead of pounding. I waited longer than I needed to, afraid that movement might bring whatever had been there back. Eventually the cold forced my hand. I started the engine and let it warm the cabin. I watched the tree line carefully as I did. Nothing moved. I got out once the light was strong enough to see. The snow around the car was disturbed in a way that made my stomach tighten. Deep impressions circled the vehicle, not like footprints in a line, but spaced unevenly, as if something had shifted its weight from place to place. They were large. Deeper near the front of the car, shallower toward the rear. Snow was pressed flat near the hood, marked by long streaks where something had brushed against it. Near the windshield, the snow was melted and refrozen in a rough patch, higher than the rest, as if warm breath had hit it repeatedly. I followed the impressions away from the car with my eyes. They led toward the trees, then disappeared where the snow fell deeper and undisturbed. As the fear eased, explanation crept in. The size, the height, the way the car had rocked without violence. The way the windshield fogged from above. A moose. I had seen them before from a distance. Along highways. In fields. Massive animals that move quietly despite their size. Drawn to roads in winter for the salt. Curious. Unafraid of cars when they are not moving. It made sense in pieces that clicked together slowly. The shortcut. The forest road. The tree line. The snowbank pushed up by plows full of salt. The car stopped right there, warm, quiet, breathing heat into the night. The moose must have approached out of curiosity, smelled the salt, the warmth. Leaned against the car the way they lean against trees to scratch or rest. Tested it with its weight. Breathed onto the glass, fogging it from above as it inspected whatever strange object sat in its path. When I yelled, it backed off. When I stayed quiet, it returned, unbothered by something that did not challenge it. Understanding did not erase the fear, but it grounded it. It turned the night into something survivable, something real. I tried moving the car again. With daylight, I could see better. I dug snow away from the tires with my hands and a brush. I rocked the car gently forward and back. After several tries, the tires caught. The car eased free of the drift and rolled back onto the road. I drove slowly the rest of the way, sticking to main roads even when the map suggested otherwise. When I finally reached my family, hours late and exhausted, I did not tell the story right away. I needed time to let it settle into something I could explain without my voice shaking. Now, when winter comes and the roads turn white, I stay where the plows go. I accept the longer drive. I accept the delay. I remember the weight against the car, the fog on the glass, and how close I came to being just another quiet shape on a snowed-in road. I do not take shortcuts anymore.